You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 401 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about the TSA, this whole scandal involving Trump allegedly having a quid pro quo with Ukrainian President Zelensky to investigate Joe Biden. And I'm talking about Yemen. So make sure you guys take the time to share the show or recommend it to someone. You find it online at the Libertarian Institute, where the show, along with my daily news roundup, are featured in the right-hand column of the homepage. If you're a new listener to the show and you like it, make sure you subscribe to the show somewhere. iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube. The show's up anywhere that people listen to podcasts. Last, you could become a donor to the show and get in on the monthly live stream. I'm going to do this month's live stream on Monday, the 30th of September, 9 p.m. Eastern time. So I hope either you guys can post some questions either on the Patreon page, in the Foreign Policy Focus Facebook group. Maybe somebody could come on and join me, either ask questions or just talk about the current foreign policy topics. And again, you get on that by being a $5 a month donor to the show at patreon.com. This is the first show of the week. Usually I do a Monday, Wednesday, Friday show, but this week's only Friday. That's because I took a vacation, didn't work at all, sat on the beach. It was very nice. I actually spent quite a bit of time reading. One of the books I brought with me was The Operators by Michael Hastings. And I really recommend, if anybody hasn't read the book, to go out, get it, and read it, because it's really good. I've actually never read the book all in one piece before. Every time I've tried, I've gotten busy. So I read 5 chapters and I don't read anything for a few weeks and then pick it back up and read a few more. And, just being able to sit and over a couple of days read the whole book was really powerful, as Hastings is a great writer, but the way he weaves in the different narratives about the Afghan war and General McChrystal is really powerful when you have the opportunity to read the book like you should read a book. Of course, in the past on the show, I've talked about the movie War Machine, Netflix movie starring Brad Pitt. It's worth watching if anybody has a chance. I mean, the book is a lot better, but your friends aren't going to maybe read a nearly 400-page book, so you get them to watch the movie War Machine after you've read the book, and you can fill them in on all the things that the movie either gets wrong or leaves out. One of the things in the book that I want to talk about, because I felt like it was really important, was that Hastings, in his reporting of Stanley McChrystal, and I guess maybe to rewind real quick here and just set the whole thing up, Michael Hastings gets an invitation from basically General Stanley McChrystal, the guy who is then in about 2010 in charge of the Afghan war, looking for the surge at the beginning of the Obama term. And so he has, Hastings come out, who is then writing for Rolling Stones. And I think it is under the idea that he wants a profile in Rolling Stones that shows him as some sort of rock star general. Like, not only is he good at winning wars, but he could kick his feet back, have a good time. But, Michael Hastings was a real journalist and war correspondent who had, been in Iraq before and had done some really good reporting, has seen some, really dangerous kind of situations. A suicide bombing, as he references in the book, says killed a woman that he loved. And I'm sure, part of what ultimately leads him to taking, his own life down the road. So, Hastings does real reporting here, and he gets all this, basically, inside the quote unquote Team America, what McChrystal's crew, kind of his top leaders and advisors called themselves after the South Park creators movie there. And they're saying bad things about Joe Biden and different diplomatic leaders of Afghanistan. Basically, things they shouldn't have said in front of a reporter, and probably shouldn't have said at all. They should be willing to work with the diplomatic advisors. They were saying that Obama was weak and wasn't willing to give them enough soldiers. And so in this book, Hastings basically goes through in more detail than the article that gets published in the Rolling Stone called The Runaway General, actually gets Stanley McChrystal fired. So I hope that's enough background on the book to, A, get everybody interested enough to read it, and also to set up, this next point that I want to make about the book. And that is, at one point, Hastings is sitting at a bar with General Flynn, who, later goes on to become Trump's national security advisor. And, he's the big intelligence guy for McChrystal, who was involved in setting up all those night raids with bad intelligence and getting so many innocent Afghans, including pregnant women, murdered by Americans. I hope that was enough of a summary of the book without getting into too much detail to want to encourage everybody to go out and check out or buy the book, and also to make, the story from within the book and this point I want to make sense. And that is a scene in the book where Hastings is sitting with General Michael Flynn, eventually national security advisor for Donald Trump, and forced out of that job in a couple of months. But anyways, at the time, Flynn is one of the high-ranking intelligence members on McChrystal's staff, and he's talking to Hastings about Osama bin Laden, and he says that he doesn't think we're going to get bin Laden. This, I think, shocks Hastings at the time, and, even reading it years later, it kind of shocks me too. He's not, saying in a propaganda way, oh, we need 100,000 troops in Afghanistan to get Osama bin Laden. Of course, that wouldn't have worked because he's been hiding out in Pakistan this whole time, a country that we're giving hundreds of millions of dollars of aid to every year. But, he's just saying, I don't think we're going to get him. Now, eventually in the Obama administration, they do kill Osama bin Laden. I guess not that it makes there any real difference in combating the jihadist threat at that point. But anyways, Hastings realizes an important point, and it's something that I really want to highlight because I think pretty much everybody doesn't realize it, yet it's the almost open and unspoken truth. And that is that the war on terror, quote unquote, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the drone wars in Somalia and Yemen and Libya, and then eventually fighting the Islamic State. It's not about getting Osama bin Laden or terrorists, whether it's Baghdadi or Zawahiri or Jolani. I think it's really just about the pretext for war. It doesn't matter to the military if they get those guys or not. Their job is to continue to fight the wars, and since there's really no clear definition of what victory in Afghanistan is, especially if it's not getting bin Laden, or there was no clear, definition of victory in Iraq, the same thing with Syria, if the U.S. has their way and we get the policy we want, that the rebels win the revolution, well, then you end up with al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda linked Syrian rebel group in Syria controlling the country. Is that what the U.S. is that our goal in Syria? And so fighting the terrorists, stopping the bad guys isn't the goal of these wars. And it's such an important point to reflect on and think about right now that, we're fighting in Afghanistan still, we're fighting in Iraq, we're fighting in, supporting Saudi Arabia, and I'm sure we got some special forces stuff going on in Yemen. Of course, all the interventions against Iran are, they're the largest state sponsor of terror, which absolutely isn't true. And especially when you look at the idea that terrorism is this radical jihadist Sunni movement that is looking to overthrow or, stomp out all the infidels in the West in order to have the Islamic Caliphate. Well, that's definitely not what, the more radical portion of the, Iranian Shia movement is doing. They're, I guess, repressive to their own people, enforcing a strict Islamic law. But they're not looking to export that towards the world. They're not looking to turn Texas into West Iran and, make all the women there wear burqas or whatever. That's not Iran. I mean, that is some people in the world. There are some coots like that. And a lot of them are, more supported by the U.S. allies, and where Iran directly opposes them. But here's, the really strong point that Hastings is able to make in the way that he writes is that it's not meaningless just because the war doesn't have a meaning if it's not to get the terrorists. It doesn't mean what the American soldiers are sent there to do is meaningless to them. And it, ends up with a lot of soldiers and a lot of innocent Afghans to die. He has one particular chapter on this young soldier named Mike Ingram Jr. And I believe in the movie War Machine, he's portrayed a little bit differently. So if you've only seen that version, that's not what you need. But when you get the book, you find out here that this is a young man who was afraid that he was going to die near the end of his tour. He was talking to his dad every day, talking about maybe not coming home. A very, kind of sad and emotional and powerful way that Hastings writes this about the relationship between this young man and his dad. But anyways, he ends up going into a building. I believe he steps on some kind of mine and ends up dying on his way to a field hospital. And, this was that young man's life. And now it's absolutely over when, prime of his life, could have been doing great things somewhere in the world instead of dying in Afghanistan. But there really isn't a mission or a point to it. And that's what all of his fellow soldiers are standing there realizing. Now, of course, that makes them hate the Afghans for not just letting the Americans get whatever kind of victory they're looking for so they could go home, rather than, I think, reflect against their own mission. Although there was certainly a lot of hostility, towards Stanley McChrystal by the soldiers as well. And, this is part of, I think, what ends up getting McChrystal fired is Hastings' article, The Runaway General, outlining that the troops really didn't understand and didn't believe in the mission. But that's because there's really no mission to understand. Even when McChrystal goes on and says something kind of smart, which is that killing insurgents leads to more insurgents, not less, because you're fighting in a native population. So if you kill somebody who is maybe a member of the Taliban, well, that just makes his uncle, his dad, and all of his cousins really mad. And then they join up the Taliban to go kill the Americans for killing their, cousin, brother, son, whatever. And you actually, rather than, let's say, killing 2 insurgents, and, he draws this thing on the board at one point during the book, McChrystal does, saying, 10 minus 2 equals 8. That's not right. 10 minus 2 equals 20 because you end up with that many more insurgents. And so you can't win that war. And yet, the task is set, and it's not all McChrystal's fault, even though he should have, told Obama, what you're asking me to do can't be done, rather than pushing for a bigger surge. But, it's this idea, I think, that's been pushed that we have to be in Afghanistan to make sure we're not attacked again on 9/11. And yet the mission in Afghanistan is unwinnable and isn't directed at getting Osama bin Laden. But none of it makes any sense. So the war isn't winnable. And yet Americans continue to this day to die for it. 17 or 18 so far in 2019. This book is written back in 2010, 2011. We're talking about 7-8 years later. I think if Hastings was alive today, he may be surprised to see that it's still going on. So one thing I was thinking and reflecting on during my trip is I'm standing in the line for airport security, which the TSA sucks. But anyways, and they're all bad at their job. But thinking, looking at the people around me who all go through the machines and let these TSA agents grope them, watching these poor old women who have to literally, barely get out of their chair, could barely, you see the stress on their face it puts as they try to lift their hands above their head for that stupid machine. And then they go through it. And then afterwards, that you have this, TSA lady feeling all the way up this old lady's leg. And it's unbelievable that everybody goes through, but it's, for them, it's to stop the terrorists, which isn't true. And it's like we have this cultural belief that all this terror war stuff is to stop the terrorists, and it's not. If you look at, facts just here about the TSA, they've never caught a terrorist. They've never stopped a terrorist attack. You had cases where people have, simulated by the TSA. They try to bring knives or guns onto planes or whatever to test airport security, and people walk right on through. I'm standing at the airport, and every time the line gets kind of long, they let a whole bunch of people walk through the metal detector rather than going through the other thing. And it's like, wait, just because the line got long, then people don't have to go through the full body scanner anymore? Doesn't, that kind of defeat the purpose of stopping terrorism? But, when they run the simulations, it's something like 95 or 96% of times they were able to get through with whatever weapons. Now, airlines have done some things that I think really did help prevent terrorist attacks from getting work, like locking the cockpit and, making sure that some terrorists can't get on the plane with the box cutter and take over the plane and fly it into a building. And so there's no reason to do that. You did have cases like the underwear bomber where the guy actually got on the plane. And the only reason the attack doesn't happen is because the terrorist himself is, incompetent and insane. Also like to point out that every time I go through airport security at different airports, it's always different. Some places you bring a whole tube of toothpaste and nobody seems to mind. Other times it gets your bag flagged and they have to check through everything. Some places you just go through the metal detector. Sometimes it's a full body scanner. Some have, sits dogs working and walking around all the time. Other airports, you don't see a dog. You barely see any people. It's quite crazy that it doesn't seem there's any real standard to any of it. And yet everybody just goes along with it. Nobody's upset that they're getting groped by these TSA agents who don't even have the courtesy to tell you what they're going to do anymore. I walk through the full body scanner. The guy tells me to stop and just starts reaching up my leg. He doesn't say, sir, the scanner over there, had some inconclusive stuff around your right thigh, so I had to go up there and feel to make sure you don't have anything. Nope, he just sticks his hand right on up there and, makes you feel very uncomfortable. And, if I had sat there and made a protest and complained, first of all, I'm somewhat afraid of getting arrested, but also everybody else in line is just going to be annoyed that I'm making a stink about it because they think he's there stopping terrorists, and it's just not the case. The last, just kind of personal anecdote I'll tell about the TSA is that I went on vacation with my fiance, and as we're going through airport security on our way back into the country, you had to go to this kiosk thing and answer all these questions, and then it takes a picture of you and you bring that to the next agent who I guess officially lets you into the United States. Well, anyways, we ended up accidentally switching forms, so I had hers and she had mine, and she goes through first. It gives the guy, my slip, and he waves her on through. Didn't even look at it. It was it was a picture of a guy. She's a girl, and he doesn't say anything. And then when I pointed out to him, I was like, "Oh, I'm sorry. She had mine. I had hers." Afraid he was going to try to stop me or something for not having the right thing. He just shrugged his shoulders and waved me on through. But we gotta protect the people, right? This is really the crazy world we live in because of the terror wars. And because we've, let this narrative be built up that it's about the terrorists when it's not. I'm still catching up on some of the news from my 5 days or so off, but there are a couple things I definitely did keep a tab on. This whole, I guess, new impeachment Ukraine scandal, or whatever you want to call it, seems like it's going to be pretty close to another nothing burger. The Trump team has released the transcript of the call. It shows that there was not any quid pro quo. Trump did ask Zelensky to, look into the whole Biden thing, but there was, some likely corruption there in Ukraine. First of all, it's known as an extremely corrupt nation, but, right after the coup in 2014 in Ukraine, sponsored by the Obama administration, and Obama was one of the spearheads on that project in the White House, Biden's son gets a job with a Ukrainian gas company. Now, he doesn't have experience in gas, but they sure do pay him $50,000 a month to have that job. And, that seems much more like a corrupt quid pro quo type situation than anything that Trump did with Ukraine. And yet that, kind of is being ignored by the media, and everybody's really just focusing on get Trump. So this is again an opportunity where I think that, hashtag never Trumpers and the Russiagators think they got Trump nailed up on an impeachment charge that looks like to be absolute bunk, but at the same time may be even worse than, initially expected for that never Trump crowd, because I think this is again going to blow up in their face. So a couple things that Trump is bringing up. The first is a little bit of a red herring, I think, where everybody came out and condemned Donald Trump for even suggesting that he would withhold aid to Ukraine if they didn't investigate Joe Biden. And that certainly didn't happen anyways. But let's say that Donald Trump did do that. There's a clip of Joe Biden saying that he was threatening to withhold aid from Ukraine for not firing a prosecutor. Now, there's kind of a mistaken story here where, Biden was pushing for that prosecutor to be fired because he was investigating his son. I guess that prosecutor was just not investigating any corruption. That's why they wanted him fired. But all the same, it is quite a bit of hypocrisy to, threaten to withhold aid from a country, because you want them to do something. And then when the next guy comes in office and threatens to withhold aid from that country because he wants them to do something else, to say, oh, that's not right. The other real scandal it exposes is the U.S. role in the 2014 coup attempt in Ukraine. This, of course, eventually leads to the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula by Russia in reaction to U.S. and NATO aggression in that country to try to get it to realign its geopolitical alignment more with the NATO axis and actually kick Russia out of a very important warm water naval base they have on the Crimean Peninsula in Sevastopol. There's also the issue that the coup side that the U.S. supported during 2014 was infested with neo-Nazi factions, followers of Stefan Bandera, who I don't know if, they would necessarily go around and round up Jews today, but are certainly like white ethno-nationalist types who, in the past have had ties with white supremacist types groups in the United States. In fact, there's a great recent anecdote to prove this, and it's an article written by Ben Norton for the Gray Zone, where the FBI just charged a U.S. soldier for saying that he was going to teach white nationalist groups in Ukraine that are now a part of that country's actual military force, the Azov Battalion, with information of how to make IEDs like are used in Afghanistan. And so, of course, in the FBI indictment, they also don't say, well, we should indict the U.S. government to the administrations of Barack Obama, but especially the administration of Donald Trump, for providing support to Ukraine when it's infested with Nazis in their military. But nope, that part's not mentioned. And of course, nobody on the whole Ukraine scandal side is bringing this up either. So this should also not only be a real scandal and a problem for Joe Biden, but one for Donald Trump. He took a step further than the Obama administration. And in part, I guess could blame the Never Trumpers for putting political pressure on him. Although at the end of the day, it is his decision on giving the military aid to Ukraine. But Trump started giving military aid to Ukraine, with their armed forces having these neo-Nazi factions involved. Of course, during the Obama administration, you could find U.S. officers meeting with Ukrainian soldiers with, neo-Nazi type patches on their uniforms and stuff like that. But, this really gets kicked into high gear under Trump, giving the Ukrainian military access to U.S. Javelin anti-tank missile systems. Just a horrible, horrible policy. So that could be a real scandal for Donald Trump. That, if they want to impeach him for that, I say go ahead. But that's not the target here. It's this alleged call with Zelensky. And of course, I think just like in Yemen, another thing that you can impeach Donald Trump for, the supporting the Saudi-led genocide there, is that, that scandal also involves attacking Obama and Biden. And so that's not going to happen. While I'm talking about Yemen, I did want to mention, I've seen a couple articles written about this. I think Daniel Larison had one at the American Conservative, but just a kind of a general thing that I've noticed, and it's good contrast to show just the ugliness of not only the United States foreign policy, but also I think really slander the U.S. media, in that everybody said we had to do something to respond against the Iranian aggression when the Houthis attacked Saudi oil facilities. But then within a week or so, Saudi Arabia attacks Yemen and kills some Yemeni children and Yemeni civilians, when, as far as we know, no actual people died in the attack on the Saudi oil infrastructure. And, nobody's demanding, Saudi account for that aggression, or we have to hold Saudi Arabia responsible. Even, any suggestion that we should stop supporting the Saudis or selling them weapons is completely off the table. And so every journalist who made a big deal about Iranian aggression and then doesn't do anything about Saudi's attack here is just really a despicable person. There's one particular article I read in Reuters about attacks on Yemeni children that disgusted me recently, where they talk about Yemeni children being killed in an airstrike and one kid losing his leg. And they say, oh, what a horrible war this has been. The Houthis have planted landmines. The Saudis have carried out airstrikes. But the Houthis' landmines have killed civilians. They never said that this kid lost his leg because of a Saudi airstrike. Possibly that plane was refueled by the U.S. and it was a U.S. bomb and a U.S. main plane that did. Nope, none of that. None of the blame for the Saudis. No moral responsibility for turning this kid into an amputee and killing two of his friends. But oh boy, the Iranians blew up an oil facility. That has to be blasted on every headline everywhere. All right. Wrapping up on today's show, another just, contrast of when the narrative fits the war narrative, then you get reporting on it. And when the story doesn't fit the war narrative, they don't cover it, or at least not so much, and don't make a big deal out of it. In Egypt, there are popular protests now again against General al-Sisi, who became the military dictator in that country after he did a U.S. backed coup. brutal leader who's arrested all of his political opponents, gets like 97% of the vote in the election. Of course, I think in the most recent election, his like closest competitor actually endorsed him. So obviously that's, more or less a one-man election there. But people are protesting against him. He's rounded up 1,900 protesters. Now, 35 people get rounded up in Hong Kong, and yeah, that is a problem if police are arresting innocent protesters there. But that's going to get story after story. It's going to be on the news. They're going to be interviewing people. The U.S. State Department is going to look at giving out aid to different people. They're going to bring protest leaders in and give them advice on tactics. But since General Sisi is one of Donald Trump's, favorite world leaders, I read a story. I can't figure out if it's true or not. I'm guessing that it's probably not because the media didn't make a bigger deal out of it. But he once saw al-Sisi and said, "Oh, my favorite dictator," or something like that. So, because this guy is kind of in the pocket of the U.S. war state, he keeps the Egyptians in line when it comes to Israeli issues, generally supports American foreign policy in the Middle East, and I guess signs on to our aggressions against the Shia groups that we don't like, and at least in some nominal way supports some of the stuff that the U.S. and our Saudi and Israeli allies are doing. We keep him in power. We like him. And so it just so happens that when protesters come out against him, we don't blow it up on the big screen and make a big deal out of it. All right, everybody, that's it for the show. Hope you enjoyed it. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, libertarianinstitute.org, at KYAAALE on Twitter, facebook.com, Foreign Policy Focus. I'll post up a post there, I guess, about asking for questions for the live Q&A show that I'm going to do next week. Of course, that will be on September 30th. That's a Monday, 9 p.m. Eastern time. I hope everybody either get their questions in, or if they want to join the call, become a donor of the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus to do that. And thanks for listening.